The West family mansion glittered under the lights of its most extravagant evening yet. Guests in shimmering gowns and crisp tuxedos filled the grand hall, their laughter mingling with the soft music drifting from the hired quartet. The charity gala was in full swing, and Ethan West, a renowned millionaire known both for his philanthropy and ruthless business acumen, was the evening's host. He drifted through the crowd, exchanging pleasantries with high-profile guests, but his mind was elsewhere. A faint sense of unease gnawed at him. Perhaps it was the sight of so many couples around him, or the way this mansion, filled with people tonight, felt oppressively empty when he was alone. His gaze drifted toward the candlelit corners of the room, lost in thoughts of a woman he hadn't seen in a decade, a woman he still loved despite the years that had passed. 10 years. 10 long years since Elena had disappeared from his life without explanation, leaving nothing but a void he'd tried to fill with work, wealth, and events like this. She was his first love, his truest love, and her disappearance had shattered something inside him, a wound that never seemed to heal. Even now, he felt her absence as keenly as he had that first night she left. As the evening wore on, Ethan's restless eyes moved over the crowd, lingering here and there. Then, out of nowhere, he saw her. A young woman was walking toward the drink station, balancing a tray of champagne glasses. She was dressed like the other waitstaff, but something about her halted his breath. Her profile, a glance over her shoulder, a quick brush of her dark hair behind her ear, was hauntingly familiar. For a moment, Ethan felt the floor tilt beneath him, his breath catching in his throat. The woman looked just like Elena. Ethan's hands clenched as he struggled to gather himself. It's impossible, he thought, but even as his rational mind tried to dismiss what he'd seen, his heart knew the truth. She had Elena's same dark eyes, the same grace in her movements. He hadn't seen her full face, yet every instinct screamed it was her. He fought to steady his breathing, aware of the guests around him, but his mind was racing. Was this some twisted illusion? He blinked, half expecting the image to dissolve, but she remained, moving quietly and gracefully through the guests as if she had no idea he was watching. Swallowing, Ethan quickly crossed the room, weaving through clusters of partygoers, his gaze locked on the woman. He followed her to the edge of the room, where she was placing empty glasses on a silver tray, and he forced himself to stay calm. "Excuse me," he said, his voice a blend of urgency and disbelief. The woman turned slowly, her expression polite but slightly wary, as if used to the attention of wealthy men who barely noticed the people serving them. "Yes, sir?" she asked, her voice soft yet familiar, sending a shiver down his spine. Ethan's gaze swept over her face, taking in every feature, the curve of her cheek, the delicate arch of her brow, the dark eyes that seemed to hold endless depths. She was identical to Elena, but something was different. This woman was younger, perhaps by a few years. Yet the resemblance was undeniable. He cleared his throat, forcing words through the tightness in his chest. "I couldn't help but notice. You look a lot like someone I once knew." The woman tilted her head slightly, her dark eyes flickering with curiosity. "I hear that sometimes," she replied with a faint smile. "But I've never met you before, sir." The formality in her tone, the lack of recognition, it threw him off. She didn't seem to know him at all. "Forgive me, but what's your name?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper, as if the answer might break some unspoken spell. "My name is Maria," she replied. "Maria!" He echoed it, almost mechanically. He felt like he was staring into the past and the present simultaneously. The name was different, but the resemblance was too striking. There was no mistaking it. This was someone connected to Elena, somehow. As Maria turned back to her work, moving to another cluster of guests with her tray of drinks, Ethan felt a surge of panic. He couldn't just let her walk away, not without finding out more. He pulled out his phone and quickly texted his longtime private investigator, Thomas, who had led the fruitless search for Elena all those years ago. He hadn't spoken to Thomas in years, but right now, there was no one else he trusted to handle something like this. "Found someone who looks just like her. She's a waitress at my event. Need to find out everything about her, tonight." The message sent, Ethan took a deep breath and kept his eyes on Maria. She seemed completely unaware of his attention, moving through the room with a calm grace, her interactions with guests polite and distant. But Ethan's mind was in a whirlwind. Who was she? And how was it possible that she looked so much like Elena? The evening continued, though for Ethan, everything else had faded into a blur. His high-profile guests, the charity speeches, none of it mattered now. His world had narrowed down to the figure moving through the room with that familiar yet elusive presence. Finally, unable to resist any longer, Ethan followed her toward the kitchen as she returned with an empty tray. He caught up with her in the dim hallway leading to the staff quarters. "Maria," he said, his voice low but firm. She turned, startled, her expression unreadable. "Yes, sir. I need to know. Do you have any family around here?" His question came out in a rush. "Any relatives?" Maria looked taken aback, her gaze guarded. "Why do you ask?" He hesitated, grasping for the right words. "You remind me of someone I once knew. Someone who disappeared." The tension between them was thick, and for a moment, she looked as if she might simply turn and walk away. But then, her gaze softened. "I don't know much about my family," she admitted, her voice barely audible. "My mother. She passed away years ago. I never knew much about her, and I don't know anything about my father." Ethan's heart pounded. Could it be? He wondered. The pieces were few, but they fit. He thought of Elena, how she had once spoken of the future they might have, of family, of children. If Elena had been pregnant when she left? A clattering sound from the kitchen startled them both, and Maria glanced back nervously. I should get back to work," she said, moving to turn away, but Ethan couldn't let her go. "Not yet. One last question," he said, his voice a near plea. "Do you have anything that belonged to your mother? Something from when she was younger?" Maria looked at him with a mixture of confusion and unease. "I have a locket. I don't wear it often, but I keep it with me." Ethan's breath caught. The locket. He had given Elena a locket as a gift the first year they were together, a delicate silver piece with a tiny ruby embedded in it. "Would you mind showing it to me?" he asked, his voice barely steady. Maria hesitated, her gaze flickering with a hint of distrust. But after a pause, she nodded and reached into her pocket, pulling out a small, weathered locket. She held it out, and the ruby glinted in the dim hallway light. Ethan stared, speechless. It was unmistakably the same locket, the very one he'd given Elena all those years ago. But before he could say anything, Maria closed her hand around it, slipping it back into her pocket with a guarded expression. "I should go," she said, and without waiting for his response, she disappeared into the kitchen. Ethan stood there in silence, his heart pounding as the realization washed over him. Maria was somehow connected to Elena, perhaps even her daughter. And if that was true, then everything he thought he knew about Elena's disappearance was about to unravel in ways he could never have imagined. As the charity event wound down, Ethan West remained rooted in the memory of his encounter with Maria, his mind spiraling with questions. The resemblance to Elena was undeniable, and the locket, the same delicate silver locket with the tiny ruby he had given Elena, confirmed that Maria was connected to his lost love. But how? Why was she here, hidden in plain sight as a waitress, seemingly unaware of her own past? The remaining guests said their goodbyes, and Ethan went through the motions, offering the obligatory smiles and handshakes, but his mind was somewhere else entirely. The very idea that Maria could be Elena's daughter, and perhaps even his own, was something he couldn't fully grasp. The decade-long ache of losing Elena, the countless nights he had spent wondering what had happened to her, all of it resurfaced with new intensity. As the last guest left, Ethan pulled out his phone to check for updates from his private investigator, Thomas. A message flashed on his screen, already on it. "I'll have more by morning. She's local, recently hired. No known family contacts in the area. More details to come." The words fueled his anxiety and curiosity alike. There was a mystery here, one that might finally answer the questions that had haunted him for so long. Ethan closed his phone and moved through the now empty mansion, making his way to his private study. There, beneath the soft glow of the antique desk lamp, He paced the length of the room, rehearsing what he'd say to Thomas in the morning. But patience eluded him. He needed answers, and he needed them now. Early the next morning, Thomas arrived at the mansion, his usual crisp professionalism intact, though Ethan could see a glint of curiosity in his eyes. Ethan wasted no time. "Tell me everything you know so far," he said, motioning for Thomas to sit. Thomas set his briefcase on the desk and opened it, pulling out a slim folder. "Her name is Maria Harper. She's 23, works for a local catering company. No known family in the area, no spouse or children. From what I could gather, she was raised in a series of foster homes until she turned 18. Ethan's heart pounded. "And her mother?" Thomas shook his head. "There's little on record. Her mother's name was listed as Elena Harper, but she passed away when Maria was very young. No mention of the father. It appears Maria has lived alone since she was old enough to move out of the foster system. She's kept a low profile, works mostly in part-time jobs. There's nothing else, at least not officially." Ethan's fingers tightened around the edge of his desk. "Elena Harper," he whispered, letting the name settle over him like a bittersweet memory. It was her. The name was different, but everything else fit. She had vanished from his life, only to surface years later under a new name. "What about the foster records?" Ethan pressed. "Any indication of where they lived, or why she was placed there?" Thomas leafed through his papers. "There's one document noting that Elena Harper placed her daughter in foster care when Maria was around 3. It's not specific, but it mentions family threats and a need to keep Maria safe. No other details on the family threats, but it's obvious Elena went to great lengths to shield her daughter." Ethan's mind raced, piecing together fragments of memories with newfound clarity. Years ago, Elena had hinted at family troubles, though she'd never shared the details. She had seemed almost haunted, especially as their relationship deepened. But he had never thought that those vague fears could have driven her into hiding, or that it would ultimately keep her away from him and their child. He rose from his chair, struggling to absorb this revelation. Maria was, in all likelihood, his daughter. A daughter he hadn't known existed until last night. "I need to know where Elena went after leaving," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "She didn't just vanish on her own. Something must have forced her to leave." Thomas nodded. "I've reopened my contacts from that old investigation. If anyone knows more, I'll find out." Ethan managed a nod, but his mind was already elsewhere. He wasn't content to simply wait. He wanted to see Maria again, to hear directly from her about the life she'd led, to bridge the chasm left by a decade of silence. But he knew he had to tread carefully. Any sudden approach might overwhelm her, especially if she had no idea about her own father. By mid-afternoon, Ethan had found a reason to reach out. He arranged for Maria to be hired as temporary staff for another gathering at the mansion later that week. It was a small event, nothing like the grand gala, but it would give him another opportunity to speak with her. The plan was risky. He couldn't risk pushing her away with too many questions too soon. He had to keep his emotions in check, though the need for answers burned in him like a fever. As the evening of the event arrived, Ethan moved through the rooms, unable to resist glancing toward the entryway, hoping Maria would arrive soon. At last, she appeared, dressed simply in her catering uniform, her demeanor quiet and unassuming as she began arranging drinks on a tray. Steeling himself, Ethan approached her with deliberate calm. "Maria," he greeted her with a warm but restrained smile. "Thank you for helping us again. Your attention to detail is remarkable." Maria looked up, her expression polite but wary, perhaps sensing the intensity of his gaze. "Thank you, Mr. West," she replied, her voice soft yet firm. She seemed slightly less guarded tonight, as if his attempt to break the ice might be working. "I noticed your locket the other night," he began, choosing his words carefully. "It looked familiar. It must be special to you." Maria's fingers instinctively brushed over the small silver pendant. "Yes," she replied. "It was my mother's. It's one of the only things I have left of hers." "I see," Ethan said, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm sorry to hear about your loss. I also lost someone very dear to me a long time ago." Maria looked up at him, something in his tone catching her attention. Her gaze held a flicker of recognition, as though his words touched a nerve, stirring some unspoken connection between them. "Your mother, did she ever talk about her past?" he asked, his voice gentle. "About family, or anyone she may have been close to?" Maria hesitated, casting her gaze down as though uncertain whether to answer. "Not much," she admitted finally. "I think she had a hard life. She was always protective of me, always afraid of something. I don't know what exactly, but she always warned me to be careful. She'd say that people can be dangerous when they want something from you." Ethan's heart ached at her words. It was as if Elena herself were speaking through Maria, a woman whose life had been shaped by fear and secrecy, all to protect the child she had loved enough to leave everything behind. "I imagine she must have been a remarkable person," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "From what little you've said, she sounds like someone who would do anything to keep you safe." Maria nodded, her eyes misting slightly. "She was, but I never understood why she was so afraid. I only knew she cared." The room around them seemed to fade, the hum of guests and clinking of glasses a distant murmur as Ethan absorbed her words. He wanted to tell her everything, that her mother had once been his world, that he had searched for her, mourned her, and never truly moved on. But he knew it was too soon, that pushing too hard might shatter the tentative trust they were building. As Maria turned to continue her work, Ethan gently placed a hand on her arm, stopping her. "Maria, if you ever want to know more about your mother's past, or your family, you can always ask me," he said, his voice thick with the weight of unspoken truths. She looked at him, her expression both curious and cautious. "Why would you know about my family?" she asked softly. For a moment, he struggled for words, feeling the enormity of what he wanted to say pressing down on him. "Because I knew someone who loved you, and I think you deserve to know more about her when you're ready." Maria's eyes held his for a long moment, as if searching for answers within his gaze. Then, slowly, she nodded, as though some part of her recognized the sincerity in his words. But before either of them could speak again, a colleague called for Maria from across the room, pulling her back into her work. She turned to leave, offering him a small, hesitant smile as she walked away. Ethan watched her go, feeling both closer to her and more lost than ever. He had to be patient, to let her come to him in her own time. But inside, his heart ached with the need to protect her, to make up for the years lost. As the night wore on, he remained in the shadows, watching her, marveling at how she had so effortlessly reignited the embers of hope within him. But with that hope came the gnawing realization that there was a past here he barely understood. A past that had stolen Elena away and, somehow, had kept Maria from him all these years. Viscazali. The morning after the event, Ethan couldn't shake the impact of his conversation with Maria. She'd been cautious yet curious, and the connection he sensed with her was unmistakable. But her guarded responses hinted at a life marked by caution, secrets, and perhaps a fear of discovering the truth herself. He knew it would take time to win her trust, but the presence of Elena's locket, the detail in Maria's eyes, these were ties he couldn't ignore. Determined, he phoned Thomas, hoping his investigator had uncovered more information. Thomas picked up on the second ring. "Good morning, Ethan. I figured you'd call." His voice held a hint of intrigue, and Ethan heard the rustle of papers. "I've got some updates for you." Ethan straightened, anxiety coiling in his chest. "Go on." "There's a bit more on Maria's background," Thomas began. Her mother, Elena Harper, filed a single legal document, listing her address at the time as a small, nearly forgotten town in upstate New York. From what I gathered, Elena lived there until Maria was around 3 years old. Then she moved. No forwarding address, nothing. But it's clear she wanted to keep Maria's location hidden. "Did you find out why?" Ethan pressed, sensing there was more. Thomas hesitated before answering. "It's only speculation, but I've heard whispers from old sources about a particular family feud. Apparently, Elena had a brother who became entangled with some unsavory figures in their hometown, leading to some powerful enemies. It's possible that Elena went into hiding to protect herself and Maria." Ethan's grip tightened around his phone. "So, you think Elena's disappearance And the reason she left Maria in foster care was to keep her away from a threat? Possibly, Thomas replied. I'm still looking for anyone in her circle who might have known more. The few who recall her say she was withdrawn, a bit of a loner, especially toward the end. She may have been hiding more than just herself. Ethan took a steadying breath, letting Thomas's words sink in. What about Maria? Did Elena leave her anything? Any clues? There's one more thing, Thomas said. I managed to contact a former foster parent of Maria's from when she was a teenager. The woman, Mrs. Hampton, remembered Maria mentioning that her mother had given her a keepsake box, but had been very specific about not opening it until Maria was ready. Ethan's mind raced. A keepsake box. It sounded like the kind of thing Elena would leave behind, especially if she had secrets to protect. Can you find out where it might be? He asked. Thomas paused. Maria likely still has it. Mrs. Hampton said Maria always kept it with her whenever she moved. My guess? She treasures it, but if she hasn't opened it, she might not feel ready to confront whatever her mother left behind. Ethan knew Maria was probably unaware of the gravity of what her mother had concealed, and he couldn't help but wonder if the contents of that box held the missing pieces to their story. He thanked Thomas and hung up, a new resolve settling over him. That afternoon, Ethan decided to call Maria. She was surprised to hear from him, her voice hesitant as she answered, Mr. West? Maria, thank you again for helping at the event, he said, keeping his tone casual. I was wondering, would you be willing to meet with me? Just for a coffee or lunch, as a small thank you. Maria hesitated, and he could almost feel her indecision. I appreciate it, Mr. West, but you really don't need to thank me, she replied, her tone cautious but polite. Please, call me Ethan, he said warmly, trying to ease her discomfort. Actually, I'd really just like the chance to talk again, if you don't mind. You mentioned your mother the other night, and I have some memories of someone who might have known her. I thought it could be meaningful to share. A long pause followed, and Ethan held his breath, waiting. Then, finally, she answered, her voice softened by curiosity. All right, I guess I have some questions too. They met at a quiet cafe the next day. Ethan arrived early, choosing a table in a discreet corner where they could speak without interruption. When Maria entered, she looked around, visibly nervous. She was dressed simply in a dark sweater and jeans, her hair loosely tied back. As she approached, Ethan felt his pulse quicken. Each time he saw her, the resemblance to Elena seemed stronger. Thank you for meeting me, he said, smiling as she took a seat. Maria gave a polite nod, her hands clasped in her lap. I don't have much time, she said, though her eyes held a flicker of curiosity. But I wanted to hear what you had to say. Ethan searched her face, noting her guarded expression. He knew he needed to tread carefully, but his heart urged him to be open. Maria, I think your mother may have been someone very dear to me, he began, choosing his words carefully. Her name was Elena, and she vanished from my life many years ago. I never understood why. Maria's brow furrowed, a mix of confusion and disbelief shadowing her features. My mother never mentioned anyone like you, she said quietly. She was always distant about her past. I never knew much about her life before I was born. Ethan nodded, understanding her skepticism. I know this is hard to believe, but your mother and I were close, and when she disappeared, it left a hole in my life that I never quite managed to fill. He paused, swallowing the emotion rising in his throat. Seeing you, it was like seeing her again. Maria's gaze dropped to her lap, her fingers twisting in her hands. After a moment, she glanced up, her expression softening. I don't know if she'd ever want me to know about her past, she admitted. But there's a part of me that's always wanted to understand. Do you have anything of hers? Ethan asked gently. Anything she left behind that might hold answers? Maria hesitated, as if wrestling with herself. Finally, she nodded. She left me a box. She said it was for me to open when the time was right. I've kept it all these years, but I've never opened it. I was afraid of what I might find. A surge of anticipation and trepidation gripped Ethan. Do you still have it? She nodded, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. Yes, it's at my apartment. Would you be willing to open it? He asked, his voice filled with hope. I believe it might hold answers for both of us. Maria looked down, her expression conflicted. I don't know, she admitted. It's been with me for so long. I've never been able to bring myself to open it. Maybe because I felt like she'd left it as a final secret, something meant to stay hidden. Ethan leaned forward, his voice soft. I understand, Maria, but maybe it's time. Maybe it's what she wanted, for you to discover who you truly are. The weight of his words seemed to settle over her, and Maria drew a shaky breath. I'll think about it, she said finally, though her voice held a hint of resolve. That evening, as Maria returned to her apartment, her mind swirled with conflicting emotions. She had long wondered about the contents of the box her mother had left, but a part of her had been too afraid to open it, fearing what she might learn. Now, with Ethan's words echoing in her mind, she knew she couldn't avoid it any longer. Maria walked to her bedroom, where the box sat on her dresser, untouched for years. She reached out, her hand trembling slightly as she traced its edges. It was a small, worn wooden box, the hinges rusted with age, but the lock was intact. Taking a deep breath, she picked it up and carried it to her bed, sitting down with her heart pounding. Slowly, Maria lifted the lid, revealing a stack of carefully folded papers, a faded photo, and a small note in her mother's handwriting. She unfolded the note, her eyes scanning the familiar cursive letters. To my dearest Maria, if you're reading this, it means I couldn't protect you from the truth forever. Please know that everything I did was to keep you safe. There are things I couldn't tell you, things that I left behind to protect you from the past I tried to escape. I hope you will find forgiveness and understand that, above all, I wanted you to be safe and free. Maria's hand trembled as she placed the note aside and reached for the photograph. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. In the photo, her mother stood beside a man she had never seen before, a man who looked strikingly like Ethan West. Ethan's face swam before her eyes, and the realization hit her with crushing certainty. This was her father. Her mother had kept him hidden from her, but here, in her hands, was the truth she had feared. In that moment, Maria knew she couldn't keep Ethan waiting any longer. With the photograph clutched tightly in her hand, she picked up her phone and called him. Her voice was shaky, barely above a whisper, as she said, I opened the box. I think we need. Ethan sat at his desk in his private study, heart pounding as he replayed Maria's words over and over in his mind. She'd actually called him. After their emotional conversation at the cafe, he hadn't been sure if she would follow through. But now, here she was, willing to speak with him again. Her voice had been quiet, filled with hesitation and nerves, but she'd sounded different somehow, as though she was ready to uncover the truth at last. They arranged to meet that evening at a secluded, quiet park on the edge of town. The setting sun cast a warm glow across the trees, and the evening air held a gentle breeze, as if nature itself was lending calm to the charged moment. Ethan arrived early, feeling every second drag as he waited for her. Finally, he saw her approaching, clutching a small, weathered box in her hands. Her expression was a mix of determination and apprehension. Thank you for meeting me, he greeted her, his voice soft. Maria nodded, and without a word, they walked to a nearby bench beneath an old oak tree. After they sat down, Ethan looked over at her, noticing the way she held the box tightly, as if it might slip away if she let go. I opened it, she said finally, breaking the silence. She opened the lid, revealing its contents, the folded letter, the faded photograph of her mother with Ethan, and a few other small trinkets that held memories she couldn't yet name. Ethan's gaze fell to the photo, and he felt his breath catch. There, in full clarity, was Elena, her arm linked with his, her gaze filled with that familiar warmth that had once filled his life with light. Seeing himself next to her, frozen in time, was both comforting and painful, a reminder of what they had once shared and of everything he had lost. Maria's voice cut through his thoughts. My mother kept you, a secret, she said softly. Her eyes were filled with questions, and beneath them, a thread of pain. I don't know why she didn't tell me about you, why she chose to raise me alone. She trailed off, her voice breaking slightly. Ethan took a deep breath, reaching for the words he had been holding back. Maria, I loved your mother deeply, he began, his voice filled with an aching honesty. Elena was the light of my life. But one day, she disappeared. I spent years trying to find her, searching for answers, but I never understood why she left. He paused, his hand shaking slightly as he reached out, his fingers brushing against the photograph. To know now that she had a reason, that it was to keep you safe, this changes everything. Maria's face softened, and Ethan could see the vulnerability in her expression. So, you never knew about me? No, he said, his voice barely a whisper. If I had known Maria, nothing could have kept me away. I would have been there for you, for her. For a moment, Maria looked down, seemingly lost in thought. I keep asking myself if she ever meant to tell me. Why she chose to live in hiding, to make so many sacrifices. She must have been terrified, but of what? Ethan exhaled, the weight of her question heavy on his mind. Your mother may have kept her reasons hidden, but I suspect it had something to do with her family. Thomas, the investigator I hired, discovered that her brother had gotten involved with dangerous people, people who might have threatened her. Maria's brow furrowed as she absorbed this. I never knew I had an uncle. She never talked about any family. I thought it was just us. The realization that Maria had lived a life without the family connection she might have had filled Ethan with a renewed sense of responsibility. Whatever happened, your mother did everything to protect you. I believe she wanted to tell you. Maybe she thought she would someday. But life doesn't always work out as we plan. They sat in silence, the gentle rustling of leaves filling the air. After a while, Maria looked back at him, her expression calmer, yet filled with a fierce resolve. Ethan, she began, and this time, she said his name without the hesitation of formality. I don't know what the future holds, and I don't even know if I'm ready for all of this. But if my mother went to such lengths to keep us safe, then I owe it to her to find out why. Her words struck him like an echo of his own unspoken desires. He reached out, his hand resting lightly on hers. Whatever you decide, Maria, I'll be here. I know I'm just a stranger to you, but you're not a stranger to me. I want to be there for you, if you'll let me. For a moment, she hesitated, her gaze on their intertwined hands. Then, slowly, she nodded. I think I'd like that. They talked late into the evening, the photo and trinkets spread between them, each one a testament to the hidden life Elena had lived. Maria shared memories of her foster years, the places she'd lived, the uncertainty that had shaped her early life. And as they spoke, Ethan felt his connection with her deepen, as if the years apart were beginning to fade, leaving a bond built on both sorrow and hope. The next morning, Ethan called Thomas, determined to dig deeper into Elena's life and the mysterious threats that had driven her to leave him. His instructions were simple but intense. Leave no stone unturned. Find everything you can about Elena's family, her brother, and anyone connected to her past. I need to know what she was up against. Thomas, ever the professional, agreed without hesitation. Within hours, Ethan received a report detailing Elena's brother, David Harper, a man with a turbulent history, known for his dealings with dangerous people in their hometown. Apparently, David had borrowed money from powerful individuals and left a trail of debt that led directly back to Elena's family. It was a dark, tangled web of betrayals and unpaid debts, one that had likely forced Elena into hiding. But Thomas had uncovered something even more disturbing. David Harper had recently been released from prison and was back in town, keeping a low profile. Ethan felt a wave of dread at the news. Could this man, Maria's uncle, still be a danger to her? Determined to protect her, Ethan invited Maria to his mansion that afternoon, hoping to tell her what he had learned. She arrived cautiously, her expression serious as she stepped into the grand foyer. I wanted to talk to you about your mother's family, Ethan said, guiding her to the study where they could speak privately. There's something I think you should know. Maria sat down, bracing herself. What did you find? Ethan took a deep breath, meeting her gaze with sincerity. Your mother had a brother, David Harper. He got involved with dangerous people, people who would have hurt your mother to get to him. She may have gone into hiding because of him. Maria looked stunned, her eyes wide with a mix of shock and anger. She never told me. All this time, I thought she left just to keep me safe. But she never said. She never said there was someone she was running from. David has resurfaced recently, Ethan continued carefully. I don't want to alarm you, but I want to make sure you're safe. If he's back, he might still be a threat. Maria absorbed his words, her face pale. I can't believe this. All my life, I thought my mother just wanted me to be cautious, that she was afraid of shadows. But she was hiding us from someone real. Ethan reached out, his hand on her shoulder. I promise I'll do everything I can to protect you. Whatever danger she faced, we'll face it together. As the weight of this revelation settled over her, Maria looked at Ethan, her eyes glistening with unspoken gratitude. Thank you. For the first time, I don't feel like I'm facing this alone. They spent the rest of the evening discussing the next steps, with Ethan assuring her that he would have security in place to monitor David's movements. But even as he reassured her, a deep unease gnawed at him. Elena had lived in constant fear because of David's choices, and now that threat was looming over Maria's life as well. As she prepared to leave, Maria paused, turning back to Ethan. You know, all my life, I felt like there was a part of me missing. But now, with everything I've learned, it feels like I'm starting to fill in the gaps. Ethan nodded, his own heart full of conflicting emotions. Then let's keep going. For your mother and for us. Maria managed a small, hopeful smile before she left, and as Ethan watched her go, he knew their journey was far from over. There were still truths left to uncover, shadows to confront. But for the first time, he felt they were moving toward the light. A light that just might bring them both the peace they'd been searching for. The days that followed their emotional meeting were a whirlwind of revelations and planning. Ethan, determined to protect Maria from the looming threat of her Uncle David, increased security around her. He insisted on daily updates from Thomas, who was tracking David Harper's movements and trying to piece together his recent activities. But despite their precautions, Ethan felt the tension growing with each passing day. The mansion felt both like a sanctuary and a prison, a stark reminder of the powerful world Ethan lived in, a world that could protect Maria or expose her to even greater danger. He spent hours each day going through files, clippings, and photographs of Elena, trying to connect with her again through the fragments she had left behind. But even as he delved into her past, the question of David's motives loomed large, leaving him anxious. Maria, meanwhile, was trying to adjust to her new reality. The truth about her mother's past, her uncle's involvement, and the potential threat to her safety weighed heavily on her. She spent more time with Ethan, finding comfort in his presence and the security he offered, but there was a distance in her eyes that hadn't been there before. It was as if the realization of her mother's fear had cast a shadow over everything she had known, and she struggled to find her place within it. Finally, after days of waiting, Thomas called Ethan with urgent news. I managed to get some information on David Harper, Thomas said, his voice low and intense. It seems he's been asking questions about Maria, discreetly, through old contacts. He's trying to find her, and from what I gather, he's not after a friendly reunion. Ethan felt his blood run cold. What does he want with her? That's the thing, Thomas replied. He's in trouble. He owes money to some dangerous people, and he's convinced himself that Maria's connection to you is his way out. He thinks you'll pay a high price to keep her safe. A wave of fury surged through Ethan. David had already destroyed one life, Elena's, and now he was willing to risk Maria's safety for his own gain. I won't let him use her like that, he said, his voice a growl. Does he know where she is? Not yet, Thomas assured him, but he's getting closer. I suggest taking immediate action. We need to confront him before he gets any ideas about approaching Maria directly. Ethan clenched his jaw, steeling himself for the decision he was about to make. Set up a meeting with him. I'll talk to him myself. Later that night, Ethan prepared to meet David Harper. They had arranged to meet at a secluded bar on the edge of town, the kind of place where secrets were whispered and silence was guaranteed. Ethan wore his calm, composed demeanor like armor, determined to face the man who had been a shadow over Maria's life for so long. When he arrived, he saw David seated at a corner table, his expression wary but defiant. David was rough around the edges, with an unshaven face and eyes that held years of bitterness and desperation. As Ethan approached, David's gaze narrowed, his lips twisting into a smirk. "So, the great Ethan West finally graces me with his presence," David sneered, raising his glass in a mock toast. "What brings you here?" Ethan sat down, meeting David's gaze with cold, unwavering eyes. "You know exactly why I'm here," he said. "I'm here to tell you to stay away from Maria." David chuckled darkly. "Maria, my dear niece. Or should I say, your daughter?" He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Did you think you could just walk into her life and erase the past? Elena and I had our own plans. You were nothing more than a means to an end." Ethan's hands tightened into fists beneath the table, but he forced himself to remain calm. "Elena went into hiding because of you," he said. "You forced her into a life of fear and secrecy. And now, you want to drag Maria into your mess. I won't let that happen." David leaned back, a bitter laugh escaping him. "My mess? Elena was the one who abandoned her family. She ran away from us, from me, because she didn't understand loyalty. But I was loyal, to my own survival. She chose to protect Maria from you," Ethan countered, his voice laced with contempt. "Whatever your grievances with her, they ended the day she disappeared. You lost that right?" David's expression shifted, a dark glint flashing in his eyes. "And yet, here we are. I may have lost Elena, but Maria is my blood. And if you care about her, you'll pay me to stay away." Ethan felt the weight of his anger pressing down on him, but he kept his voice steady. "What kind of man are you to use your own niece as leverage? Haven't you caused enough damage?" David's smile twisted. "I'm a man who knows when he's cornered. And right now, I need an out. You pay me, and I disappear from her life forever. Refuse, and I make things very, very complicated for her." Ethan met his gaze, disgusted but resolute. "You won't get a cent from me. And if you come near Maria, I'll make sure you're the one who disappears. Permanently." David's face darkened, the threat sinking in. But before he could respond, Ethan rose from the table, casting one final, warning glare at the man who had torn apart the lives of two women he loved. "This is your only chance to walk away, David. If you don't, I'll make sure you regret it." Without another word, Ethan left the bar, the tension thrumming in his veins as he stepped into the cold night air. He was done waiting for David to strike. It was time to ensure Maria's safety once and for all. The next day, Ethan met with Maria to tell her about the confrontation. They met in the sunlit garden of the mansion, where Maria could feel both safe and at ease. But even in the comforting surroundings, her expression grew tense as he recounted his conversation with David. "So he's been looking for me?" she asked, her voice filled with disbelief. "All this time, I thought he was just a figure in my mother's past. I never thought he'd actually want to find me." Ethan reached out, taking her hand gently. "He's desperate, Maria, and people like him, they don't stop until they get what they want. But I won't let him hurt you. We'll take every precaution, and if he tries anything, I'll make sure he's taken care of." Maria looked away, her expression troubled. I can't believe he'd go this far. My mother gave up everything to protect me from him, and now, after all these years, he's back." Ethan squeezed her hand, his gaze softening. "Your mother loved you, Maria. She sacrificed everything to give you a life free from fear. And now, it's up to us to honor that sacrifice." They sat in silence, the weight of his words settling over them like a shared vow. After a moment, Maria looked back at him, her eyes filled with resolve. "Then let's do whatever it takes. I don't want to live in fear like my mother did. I want to confront this, to end it." Ethan nodded, admiration shining in his eyes. "You're brave, Maria, braver than you know." Later that evening, as Ethan prepared for bed, his phone buzzed with a message from Thomas. It was a single line: "David Harper has left town. For now, he's gone." Ethan felt a wave of relief, but he knew better than to let his guard down. David might be gone for now, but men like him rarely disappeared for good. He would keep a close eye on the situation, ensuring that Maria was safe no matter what. The mansion was quiet, bathed in the glow of the moonlight as he made his way to his bedroom. But before he could settle in, he heard a knock at his door. Opening it, he found Maria standing there, her eyes filled with gratitude and vulnerability. "Ethan," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper, "I wanted to thank you for everything, for standing by me when I didn't even know I needed it." Ethan felt a warmth spread through him, and he took her hand gently. "Maria, your family. I'll always be here for you." They stood in silence, the bond between them deepening with every shared glance. Whatever the future held, they knew they could face it together. And for the first time, Ethan felt that the hole left by Elena's absence was beginning to heal, replaced by a newfound purpose and connection. But even as they shared a quiet moment of peace, a faint, lingering sense of dread remained. The past had a way of returning, and Ethan knew that their journey was far from over. But for now, they had each other, and that was enough. Viscazali. In the days following David's departure, a tentative sense of calm settled over Ethan and Maria. With the immediate threat removed, they both felt as if a heavy weight had lifted. Maria began spending more time at the mansion, growing closer to Ethan, and slowly easing into the idea of having him in her life as her father. But the respite was short-lived. Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that David would return, desperate and dangerous as ever. And even with the precautions he'd taken, something within him warned that the past was not done with them yet. One evening, while Ethan was reading in his study, Thomas called with a tone of urgency in his voice. "Ethan, I did some more digging into David's recent movements before he fled town," Thomas said. "He's been reaching out to some very dangerous people, old associates who don't take betrayal lightly. I think he's more desperate than we realized." Ethan listened, tension building as Thomas continued. "One more thing," he added. "In my investigation, I found something odd. Elena had a bank account under a false name, one she maintained for years after leaving you." The revelation hit Ethan hard. A bank account? Why would she need that? "I believe it was a way for her to protect Maria, to ensure they had something to fall back on if she was ever found. But here's the strange part. After her death, someone continued making deposits into that account. It's almost as if someone else knew about Elena's situation and was helping her from the shadows." Ethan's pulse quickened. This new piece of information suggested that someone beyond David might have been aware of Elena's whereabouts. The thought made his skin crawl. "Who's been making the deposits?" he asked, his voice tense. "Can't say for certain," Thomas replied, "but I have a lead. There's a man named Victor Kane, a former associate of David's and a known fixer for anyone in need of quiet assistance. He's the last person who made contact with David before he fled." Ethan gripped his phone, realizing what this could mean. If Victor Kane had ties to both David and Elena, he might know more about the reasons behind Elena's disappearance, and even why she felt Maria needed protection. "Track him down," Ethan said, his voice resolute. "I need to know what he knows." A few days later, Thomas contacted Ethan with a breakthrough. He had managed to locate Victor Kane, who reluctantly agreed to meet with Ethan under the condition that they meet alone. They met in a dimly lit bar on the outskirts of the city, a place where people came to be forgotten. Victor was waiting in a booth, his face hidden in the shadows. He was a wiry man in his 60s, with shrewd eyes and a face etched with years of secrets. Ethan approached cautiously, his heart pounding as he sat down across from him. Victor eyed Ethan with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. "So, you're the one who's been digging into Elena's past," he said, his voice low. "What exactly do you want to know?" Ethan met his gaze, determined. "I want to know why Elena left, why she felt the need to go into hiding, and why you've been paying into her account all these years." Victor leaned back, a bitter smile playing on his lips. "Elena, she was a beautiful, spirited woman. She didn't deserve what happened to her. But she made a choice to protect herself and her child from a world she didn't want to be part of." Ethan felt his throat tighten. A world she didn't want to be part of because of David? Victor's eyes flashed with anger. David was part of it, sure, but there was more. Elena came from a powerful family, a family with deep ties to organized crime. She was born into it, but she wanted nothing to do with that life. When she met you, she thought she could leave it all behind. But people like that, they don't let go easily. Ethan felt a chill run down his spine. Are you saying that Elena was forced to disappear? Victor nodded grimly. Her family was willing to let her go, but David was in too deep. He owed money, and Elena was his only leverage. So she left, hoping to protect you and her daughter. But she knew it was only a matter of time before they'd come looking. Ethan's mind spun with the weight of this revelation. Elena hadn't left him by choice. She'd been forced to flee to protect him and Maria from her family's grasp. The realization both relieved and devastated him. Why did you keep paying into her account? Ethan asked, his voice barely a whisper. Victor's expression softened. Because Elena trusted me. She asked me to make sure that if anything happened to her, her daughter would have a future. She may not have known much about the world she left behind, but she knew it was dangerous. She wanted Maria to have a life free from it. Ethan felt a surge of gratitude, tinged with grief. He'd spent years mourning Elena, feeling abandoned. But now, he understood the sacrifice she'd made, a sacrifice she hadn't wanted him to know about. What about David? He pressed. Will he return? Victor's face hardened. David is reckless. He doesn't care who he hurts, as long as he gets what he wants. But he won't stop until he's paid his debts or someone stops him. Ethan leaned forward, his gaze steely. I won't let him ruin Maria's life. Not after everything her mother went through to protect her. Victor studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he gave a small nod. Good. Because that girl deserves a chance at a normal life. And if you're serious about keeping her safe, you'll have to be willing to do whatever it takes. Ethan left the bar feeling the weight of responsibility settle heavily on his shoulders. Protecting Maria wasn't just about keeping her physically safe. It was about freeing her from the ghosts of the past and the legacy she'd inherited. For the first time, he understood the depth of Elena's sacrifice and the love she must have felt to go to such lengths. That evening, Ethan invited Maria back to the mansion, knowing it was time to share everything he had learned. They sat in his study, the same room where he'd once imagined a future with Elena, never knowing the danger that lurked in her past. Maria, he began, his voice gentle, I need to tell you about your mother's family. I know this will be hard to hear, but it's important you understand why she made the choices she did. Maria looked at him with a mix of apprehension and trust. Go on, she said softly. Ethan took a deep breath, recounting everything Victor had told him about Elena's family, her ties to organized crime, and her desperate desire to protect Maria from that life. He explained how Elena had tried to leave it all behind, only to be forced into hiding because of David's debts. As he spoke, Maria's face grew pale, her expression one of quiet devastation. When he finished, she looked down, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. I spent my whole life wondering why she left, why she was so afraid, she whispered. And now I know it was to protect me. But she never told me. She left me in the dark, and I hated her for it. Ethan reached for her hand, his gaze filled with understanding. Your mother made an impossible choice. She wanted you to be safe, even if it meant sacrificing her own happiness. She didn't want you to grow up in fear. A tear slipped down Maria's cheek, and she brushed it away, her voice wavering. I spent so many years feeling alone, like I didn't belong anywhere. But now, knowing the truth, I feel closer to her, like I finally understand her. They sat in silence, the weight of the truth settling between them like a shared secret. After a moment, Maria looked at Ethan, a newfound strength in her eyes. What do we do now? She asked, her voice steady. Ethan squeezed her hand, feeling a surge of pride. We make sure you're safe. I'll increase security around you, and I'll continue tracking David. He's still out there, but I won't let him come near you. Maria nodded, her gaze fierce. I don't want to live in fear anymore. I want to confront this, to end the hold my mother's past has on me. Ethan nodded, admiration shining in his eyes. Then we'll face it together. Whatever comes next, we'll handle it as a family. For the first time, Maria gave him a small, genuine smile. The barriers that had once separated them were beginning to crumble, replaced by a bond built on trust and a shared history. As the evening wore on, Ethan and Maria talked long into the night, planning their next steps and preparing for whatever lay ahead. The past had finally been unraveled, but the future remained uncertain. They both knew that David could return at any moment, bringing with him the dangers of a world neither of them wanted to face. But for now, they had each other, and that was enough. In the quiet of the mansion, father and daughter found solace in the truth and the promise of a new beginning, a life free from the shadows that had haunted them for so long. Ethan and Maria's newfound closeness felt fragile yet promising, like the first rays of sunlight after a long, dark night. They had opened up to each other, shared secrets, and begun to piece together the puzzle that was Elena's life. But even as they grew closer, there was an unspoken understanding between them. David was still out there, a shadow lurking on the edges of their newfound peace. One morning, Thomas called Ethan with a new piece of information. "Ethan," he said, sounding more urgent than usual, "I've been tracking some recent movement on David's end. He's been making inquiries, looking for something specific. A document." "What kind of document?" Ethan asked, pacing his study as he listened intently. "It appears to be a legal paper, something from Elena's past. My sources say it's tied to a piece of property she once owned, one that's still legally under her name. David seems to think it's valuable, either financially or as leverage against you and Maria. If we find that document, we may gain insight into what he's after and why he's so desperate." The news jolted Ethan, setting off a chain of thoughts. Why would Elena still have property? What could be so valuable that David would risk returning to search for it? There was only one way to find out. "Where is the property?" he asked, the determination in his voice unmistakable. "It's in upstate New York, in a small town called Gray Hollow," Thomas replied. "It's secluded, barely even on the map. I doubt Elena lived there openly, but she must have kept it for a reason." Ethan took a deep breath, feeling a mixture of dread and anticipation. This property could hold the final pieces of Elena's story, answers to the questions that still haunted them. And if David was after it, they needed to act fast. "I'll go there myself," he decided, "and I'll take Maria with me. If there's anything left of her mother's, she deserves to see it." The drive to Gray Hollow was long and winding, the road lined with thick trees and a mist that hung over the landscape like a veil. Maria was quiet, her gaze distant as she looked out the window, lost in thought. Ethan reached over, giving her hand a reassuring squeeze. "Are you sure you're up for this?" he asked gently. She nodded, her voice steady but soft. "I need to see it, Ethan. I need to understand what my mother was running from. If there's anything left of her here, I want to know." They finally arrived at a modest, weather-beaten cottage hidden among towering pines. The property looked untouched, almost forgotten, with wildflowers growing along the edges and a small path winding toward the front door. As they stepped out of the car, Ethan noticed Maria's expression, caught somewhere between nostalgia and sadness, as if she were connecting to a part of herself she'd never known. They approached the door, and Ethan turned the rusty key Thomas had managed to locate. The door creaked open, revealing a simple, dusty interior with sparse furnishings. A sofa, a wooden table, and a few shelves lined with old books. A faint scent of lavender lingered in the air, reminding Maria of the faint fragrance her mother used to wear. As they walked further in, Maria's eyes fell on a small table by the window, where a framed photograph of Elena sat. She picked it up, her fingers trembling as she traced the outline of her mother's face. It was the first time she had seen a photograph of her mother as a young woman, her hair loose around her shoulders, her smile soft and hopeful. For a moment, it felt as if Elena was there with her, watching over them in spirit. "Why would she keep this place?" Maria asked, her voice barely a whisper. "If she was running, why not leave everything behind?" Ethan shook his head, his gaze scanning the room. "Maybe she needed a safe place to return to. Or perhaps she left something here she wanted you to find someday." They continued exploring the small cottage, moving through each room with a quiet reverence. In the bedroom, Maria found a small jewelry box on the dresser, filled with simple trinkets, a pair of pearl earrings, a locket, and a ring she recognized from her mother's stories. As she looked around, something caught Ethan's eye, a hidden compartment in the floorboards beneath the bed. He knelt down, carefully prying it open, and inside he found a small stack of papers, yellowed with age. Among them was a deed to the property, along with a legal document bearing Elena's signature. He handed the papers to Maria, who read them with a mix of disbelief and wonder. "This says she intended to leave this property to me. She signed it over to me years ago." Ethan felt a pang in his chest as he realized the significance of this discovery. Elena had prepared for the possibility that Maria might one day return here, knowing she might not be able to explain everything in person. It was a gift, a final, unspoken act of love. "There's a letter here," Maria whispered, unfolding a small, handwritten note tucked between the papers. Her eyes filled with tears as she read her mother's words. "My dearest Maria, if you're reading this, it means I couldn't keep my promise to be there for you. But know that every choice I made was for you, for the life I dreamed you would have, free from the shadows of my past. I kept this place for you, hoping it would bring you peace. One day, I hope you'll forgive me and understand why I had to leave. Remember, my love for you is endless." "Mom," Maria's voice broke, and she lowered the letter, a tear slipping down her cheek. Ethan placed a comforting hand on her shoulder, his own heart aching at the pain and love woven into Elena's words. "She wanted you to be free," he murmured, his voice filled with emotion. "She sacrificed everything for you, Maria, and she loved you until the very end." For a long moment, they stood in silence, the weight of Elena's legacy settling around them like a protective embrace. But just as Maria folded the letter carefully and placed it back with the other papers, the peaceful silence was broken by the sound of footsteps outside. Ethan immediately tensed, his instincts on high alert. He moved to the window, his breath catching when he saw David Harper approaching, his expression twisted with a mix of desperation and anger. He had found them. "Maria," Ethan whispered, pulling her away from the window. "David's here. We need to leave now." But it was too late. The door creaked open, and David stepped inside, his gaze landing on Ethan and Maria with a chilling smile. "Well, well," he sneered, his voice dripping with bitterness. "I see you found the family hideaway. Didn't expect to see me, did you?" Ethan moved protectively in front of Maria, his voice cold. "You need to leave, David. You've caused enough damage." David laughed darkly, his gaze flickering to the papers in Maria's hand. "Oh, I don't think so. You see, that property deed and those documents, they belong to me now. I came to collect what's rightfully mine." "This isn't about you," Maria said, her voice shaking but resolute. "This was my mother's legacy, her gift to me." "Your mother's legacy?" David spat, his tone mocking. "Your mother was a fool who thought she could escape her past. She tried to run, but people like us don't get that luxury." "People like you," Ethan corrected, his eyes hard. "Elena chose a different path. She didn't want any part of your life." David's face twisted in anger. "It doesn't matter, because as far as I'm concerned, Maria owes me. Her mother owed me, and I intend to collect." He took a step forward, but Ethan stood his ground, his voice low and dangerous. "If you take another step, you'll regret it. Maria doesn't owe you anything. You lost that right when you drove her mother into hiding." David sneered, but Ethan could see the desperation behind his bravado. "You think you can protect her? You're just a wealthy fool clinging to a fantasy. I'll be back, and next time, you won't be so lucky." With one last, venomous look, David turned and stormed out, slamming the door behind him. The silence that followed felt heavy, charged with the unresolved tension of a battle only temporarily averted. Ethan turned to Maria, who was visibly shaken but resolute. "Are you all right?" he asked gently. She nodded, though her expression was grim. "We can't keep running from him, Ethan. My mother lived her whole life in fear, but I don't want that. I want to put an end to this." Ethan's heart swelled with pride at her strength. "Then we'll do whatever it takes." David's made his intentions clear, and he won't stop until he's forced to. As they left the cottage, the weight of their discovery lingered, along with the knowledge that they had just uncovered Elena's final wishes. But David's presence loomed like a dark cloud, reminding them that their journey was far from over. Ethan and Maria drove back in silence, each lost in their own thoughts yet united in their determination. They were no longer alone, and they would face whatever came next together, guided by the love and sacrifice that had brought them here. Back at the mansion, the tension was palpable as Ethan and Maria processed the encounter at the cottage. David's reappearance had shattered the brief calm they'd managed to find, replacing it with a fierce determination. Maria was resolute. She would no longer allow her mother's past to dictate her life. She wanted to end David's hold over her once and for all. The following morning, Ethan called Thomas. "We need to escalate our efforts," he told his investigator. "David's intent on taking anything he can from Maria, and I can't allow him to keep her life in the shadows. Find out everything you can on his next move." Thomas responded swiftly, and within hours, he had a new lead. "Ethan," he said, voice tense over the phone, "David's been seen meeting with Victor Kane again. It seems they're plotting something." Ethan felt a surge of anger. Victor Kane? I thought he was finished meddling in this. What could they possibly be planning now? "It's hard to say," Thomas replied. "But from what I gathered, David's trying to gain control of Elena's assets, especially the cottage. They think it holds more than sentimental value. They believe it contains proof of inheritance or access to a hidden fortune Elena might have left behind." Ethan gripped his phone, feeling a chill. "A hidden fortune?" he repeated. He remembered Elena's simple lifestyle, her unadorned love for him, and the sacrifices she'd made for Maria. She had never cared for wealth, yet it seemed her family's shadow loomed larger than he'd anticipated. "I'll dig deeper," Thomas assured him, "but I'd advise preparing for the worst. David isn't just after money. He wants control. He wants leverage, and he'll use Maria to get it." Determined to take matters into their own hands, Ethan and Maria revisited the documents they'd found at the cottage. As they pored over each page, they discovered several letters from Elena to Maria, letters she'd written but never sent. In these letters, Elena hinted at a family trust, a substantial inheritance hidden away, one she had intended for Maria alone. "Look at this," Maria murmured, pulling out one of the letters. "She wrote that she'd secured a future for me, a freedom from the chains of the past. I think she was planning to leave everything to me, without David ever knowing." Ethan's heart ached at Elena's foresight, her determination to give Maria a life untouched by her family's darkness. She must have hidden this inheritance to keep it from David. She knew he would try to exploit you if he found out. But how did she manage to keep it hidden? Maria wondered aloud. "My mother didn't have much money when I was young. How could she have built a trust?" Ethan thought back to Victor's words about Elena's powerful family connections. Perhaps, despite her efforts to leave that life behind, she'd managed to safeguard a small fortune as a contingency. It was possible she'd hidden it with the help of someone she trusted, someone who understood her need to protect Maria's future. After hours of searching, they found a key taped inside the back of one of the envelopes. The key was small and unmarked, with no obvious indication of what it unlocked. Maria turned it over in her hand, her expression thoughtful. "What do you think it opens?" she asked. Ethan considered it. "My guess? A safety deposit box, or perhaps another hidden compartment at the cottage. We should go back there tomorrow and see what we can find." The next morning, they returned to the cottage, armed with the key and a growing sense of urgency. As they entered, Maria couldn't shake the feeling that her mother's spirit was guiding them. She felt closer to Elena now than she ever had, the truth of her mother's love and sacrifice wrapping around her like a protective cloak. They searched the cottage meticulously, but it wasn't until Maria moved a loose floorboard near the fireplace that she found something. Beneath it lay a small, metal lockbox. Heart pounding, Maria inserted the key and turned it, the lock clicking open with a satisfying sound. Inside, they found a stack of legal documents, along with a letter bearing Elena's signature. As Maria read through it, her eyes widened. This is it," she whispered. "It's the deed to the family trust, transferred to my name. She left it all to me." Ethan leaned in, examining the document. It confirmed that Elena had set up a trust in Maria's name, completely separate from her brother's influence. It was an ironclad legacy, financial security and freedom from the past that had haunted her. But the document also contained a warning. "To my dearest Maria, Know that accepting this trust means accepting a legacy. You have the power to choose the life you want, but you must be cautious. Some will stop at nothing to control what is rightfully yours. Ethan looked up, his gaze meeting Maria's. This was her final gift to you. A life she dreamed of, free from the fears she lived with. Maria nodded, her expression fierce. Then it's time to stop running. I won't let David take what she left for me. They returned to the mansion, their spirits lifted by the discovery. But just as they were beginning to discuss next steps, Thomas called Ethan with grim news. David's back in town, Thomas said. And he's not alone. He brought a few hired men with him. They've been asking around about you and Maria. My sources say he's planning to confront you directly. Ethan's hand clenched around the phone. Do whatever it takes to keep him away from her. Thomas assured him that security was already in place, but Ethan knew this wouldn't be a simple confrontation. David wouldn't stop until he had what he wanted. That night, Ethan and Maria braced themselves for the storm that was coming. They spent hours going over their plans, preparing for every possibility. Finally, as the clock struck midnight, they heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching the mansion's front door. Ethan exchanged a tense glance with Maria. Stay here, he instructed, moving toward the door with a calm determination. But Maria refused, following him with a resolve he couldn't deny. When he opened the door, they found David standing on the threshold, his expression smug and unyielding. He was flanked by two men, their presence imposing yet silent. Good evening, Ethan, David sneered. His gaze shifted to Maria, his eyes gleaming with a twisted satisfaction. Maria, my dear niece, we need to talk about what's rightfully mine. Ethan moved protectively in front of her, his voice cold. You're trespassing, David. Whatever you think you're owed, you're not getting it. David's smile widened, his tone dripping with malice. This is family business, Ethan. Maria, I'm here to claim what belongs to both of us. Our inheritance, the trust your mother left. Maria met his gaze, her voice steady. You have no right to any of it. My mother wanted me to have a life free from you, from all of this. David's face twisted in anger. Your mother was a fool, running from her family, but you're just like her, naive and ungrateful. Ethan stepped forward, his posture firm. You've taken enough from Maria and Elena. Leave now, or I'll make sure you never come near her again. David's eyes gleamed with fury. You think I'll just walk away? I'm not leaving empty-handed, Ethan. Ethan held his ground, his tone deadly. Then you've underestimated us. The standoff stretched into tense silence. Just as David took a step forward, two figures appeared behind him, Thomas and a security guard. David's smirk faltered, realizing he was outmatched. Leave now, David, Thomas warned, his voice firm. This is your last chance. David glared at them, his face contorted with rage. But finally, he backed down, spitting a final threat. This isn't over. You'll regret this. With one last glare, he turned and disappeared into the night, his footsteps fading into silence. Ethan and Maria remained by the door, breathing heavily as the tension ebbed away. Inside, they collapsed onto the living room couch, the weight of the encounter settling over them. Maria looked at Ethan, her expression a mix of relief and lingering fear. Do you think he'll come back? She asked softly. Ethan reached for her hand, his voice gentle but resolute. He might, but I promise you, Maria, I won't let him hurt you. We'll make sure he never controls you or what your mother left you. They sat in silence, holding on to each other as they absorbed the night's events. Despite the lingering threat, Maria felt a sense of peace, a strength she hadn't known before. She was no longer a prisoner of her past. She had finally found her family, and with Ethan by her side, she knew she could face whatever came next. Together, they had confronted the darkness of Elena's past. And though David's shadow still lingered, Maria knew that, for the first time, she was ready to stand up to it and reclaim the future her mother had dreamed for her. The night after David's confrontation hung heavy over the mansion. Ethan had taken every precaution to protect Maria, increasing security around the property and ensuring that David's movements were monitored. But despite their preparations, a persistent tension lingered, an unspoken fear that David would try to strike again. As the days passed, Maria began to regain a sense of calm. She focused on her mother's legacy, diving into her memories of Elena and trying to come to terms with the revelations of her past. The knowledge that her mother had left everything to protect her brought her comfort, but it also reignited her desire to free herself fully from David's grasp. One afternoon, as she sifted through her mother's belongings at the mansion, Maria came across an old journal tucked away in one of Elena's boxes. It was a simple leather-bound notebook, its pages worn and faded. As she opened it, a letter slipped out, falling into her lap. Her heart skipped a beat as she unfolded the letter, her mother's familiar handwriting bringing tears to her eyes. It was a letter to her future self, filled with words of love and hope. To my beautiful Maria, if you're reading this, you've found the truth about our past, about the family we left behind. I never wanted this life for you, never wanted you to live in fear. But I hope that by the time you read this, you'll be free of that burden. My love for you is endless, and I know you'll find a way to live the life I dreamed for you. Remember, you have a strength that no one can take from you. And know that wherever I am with you. Maria clutched the letter to her chest, feeling her mother's presence more deeply than ever. This was the final piece of the puzzle, the last affirmation that Elena had always believed in her ability to build a life beyond the shadows of her past. Filled with newfound determination, Maria went to find Ethan, who was in his study. She showed him the journal and the letter, her expression resolute. "I want to end this, Ethan," she said firmly. "I don't want to keep looking over my shoulder, waiting for David to show up. I want to take control of my life." Ethan looked at her, admiration shining in his eyes. "Then let's make sure you can. We'll find a way to put an end to David's interference, once and for all." That evening, Thomas called with unexpected news. "I've tracked David's recent activity," he told Ethan. "It seems he's left the city and gone to the old family estate upstate. It's likely he's hiding out there, trying to regroup." The family estate was a decaying mansion in a secluded part of the state, surrounded by dense woods and long abandoned by Elena's side of the family. Ethan had heard about it in passing, but Elena had never taken him there, wanting to leave behind everything associated with her family's troubled past. Ethan and Maria exchanged a look, both of them feeling the same resolve. "I need to go there," Maria said, her voice steady. "If he's hiding at the estate, it's time we confront him on our terms." Ethan hesitated, worry flickering in his eyes. "Maria, it could be dangerous. He might still have allies, and he's shown he's willing to go to any lengths to get what he wants." "I know," she replied, "but I'm done being afraid of him. My mother left that life for me, and I want to honor her by facing this head-on." Ethan saw the determination in her eyes and knew she was right. They couldn't keep running from David or hoping he'd go away. They had to put an end to his influence over her life. "All right," he said, his voice resolute, "but we're not going alone. I'll make sure Thomas is there, along with security. We'll confront him and make sure he understands that you're not his to control." The next day, Ethan, Maria, and Thomas drove up to the estate, a looming structure surrounded by thick trees and overgrown gardens. The air was heavy with silence, the kind of quiet that held old secrets and memories long buried. The mansion itself was a decaying relic, its stone walls weathered and crumbling, but it held an eerie grandeur that reminded them of the family history Maria had inherited. They approached the door cautiously, Ethan and Thomas on high alert as Maria knocked. The door creaked open, and they were greeted by a tense silence. For a moment, it seemed as if the mansion was empty, but then they heard footsteps echoing through the dark hallway. David appeared, his face twisted in a smug grin. "Ah, the family reunion I never asked for," he sneered, his gaze shifting from Maria to Ethan. "And you've brought your millionaire protector. How predictable." Maria stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "This ends today, David. You've been using my mother's memory, her legacy, to justify your greed. But it stops now." David laughed, a dark, hollow sound. "Your mother ran from the family, from her responsibility. She left me to deal with the fallout. You owe me for everything I had to endure because of her choices." Maria's eyes hardened. "I don't owe you anything. My mother left her legacy to me, not to you." She wanted me to have a life free from this family's darkness, and I intend to honor her wishes. David's expression shifted, a flicker of desperation crossing his face. You think you can walk away from this? From the family's power? You're as much a part of this as I am, Maria. No, she replied, her voice steady. I choose a different life. My mother wanted that for me, and I'm choosing it for myself. Ethan moved forward, his gaze steely. You heard her, David. This is her decision, not yours. You can either accept it or face the consequences. David's face twisted with fury, but he didn't reply. Instead, he took a step back, his eyes narrowing as he assessed the situation. For a moment, it looked like he might lash out, but something in Ethan's stance, the resolute confidence in Maria's eyes, seemed to disarm him. Finally, David sneered, his tone laced with bitterness. Fine, but don't think you've seen the last of me. You may have the money and the power now, but family ties run deep. Remember that. With one last glare, David turned and disappeared into the mansion's shadows, leaving them standing in silence. Ethan and Maria exchanged a glance, relief and exhaustion mingling in their expressions. It's over, she murmured, though her voice held a trace of disbelief. Ethan took her hand, his gaze softening. Yes, it's finally over. Your mother's sacrifice, everything she endured, it's finally been honored. The days that followed were filled with a sense of calm Maria had never known. The legal proceedings ensured that David could never interfere in her life again, and she felt the weight of her mother's legacy in a new light, no longer something to fear, but a memory to cherish. Ethan, too, felt a sense of closure, knowing that he'd finally been able to honor Elena's wishes and protect the daughter he'd never known he had. He and Maria grew closer, building a bond of trust and understanding that bridged the years they'd lost. He took her to the places he'd dreamed of sharing with her mother, sharing stories of their love, of the life he'd once imagined. One evening, as they walked through the mansion gardens, Maria looked at Ethan, her gaze filled with gratitude. Thank you, Ethan, she said softly, for being there, for believing in me, even when I didn't know if I could believe in myself. Ethan smiled, a warmth filling his heart. You're my daughter, Maria. I would do anything for you. And your mother. She would be so proud of the woman you've become. As they walked together, side by side, Maria felt a peace she hadn't thought possible. She was free of her past, free of the fear that had haunted her, and surrounded by the love of the family she'd always longed for. In the weeks that followed, Maria made plans to transform the cottage into a sanctuary, a place where she could honor her mother's memory and help others who had faced difficult pasts. She worked with Ethan to establish a foundation in Elena's name, a testament to the strength and resilience her mother had shown. At the dedication ceremony, Ethan stood by her side, watching with pride as Maria spoke to the gathered crowd, her voice filled with conviction. My mother, Elena, taught me the true meaning of sacrifice and love, Maria said. And today, I honor her legacy by dedicating this foundation to those who, like her, have faced hardship but still choose love and hope. As she finished speaking, she looked at Ethan, a tear slipping down her cheek, but her smile was radiant. Ethan felt his own eyes mist, overcome by pride and love. In that moment, he knew that Elena's dream for Maria had come true. Their family was whole again, united by the strength of love and a future that was finally free from the shadows of the past. As Maria's life began to settle, a profound sense of peace filled the mansion that she now called home. The tension, once a constant presence, had given way to a quiet calm. The foundation established in Elena's name had garnered attention, bringing new purpose and hope to Maria. With Ethan's unwavering support, she had transformed her family's painful past into a legacy of healing and resilience. But even as she poured herself into this new chapter, a lingering unease remained. Though David had retreated from her life, his final words, "You haven't seen the last of me," haunted her thoughts, a reminder that their peace could be shattered at any moment. Maria refused to live in fear, but she knew the threat wasn't fully over. One evening, as Maria and Ethan discussed the foundation's upcoming projects in his study, Thomas interrupted, his face etched with concern. "Ethan, Maria," he began, his tone serious, I thought you'd want to know. I've received word that David's been seen in the city. He's been asking about the foundation, about you, Maria." Maria felt a chill run through her, though she forced herself to remain calm. "What does he want now?" "It's unclear," Thomas replied, "but he seems to be looking for leverage. He might try to sabotage the foundation, or use it to get your attention. He knows how much it means to you." Ethan's face hardened. "Enough is enough. We've tried reasoning, but if David refuses to respect Maria's wishes, it's time we put an end to this once and for all." They devised a plan. Instead of waiting for David to make a move, they would confront him head-on. Ethan arranged a meeting in a neutral location, a secluded estate owned by a trusted friend. They ensured it would be secure, with Thomas and his team positioned nearby to prevent any attempts at coercion or violence. On the day of the meeting, Maria and Ethan arrived early, their expressions solemn but resolute. Maria felt a strange mixture of fear and determination. This was her chance to take control of her life, to finally tell David, face to face, that his influence over her was over. When David arrived, his face held a blend of arrogance and desperation. He wore a forced smile, but his eyes were sharp, calculating, taking in every detail of their surroundings. "Quite the welcoming committee," he sneered, eyeing the security presence. Ethan stepped forward, his gaze unwavering. "This ends here, David. We're here to make sure you understand that Maria's life, and everything her mother left behind, are no longer yours to manipulate." David shrugged, feigning indifference. "You think you can just erase me from this family? I'm as much a part of it as she is." He turned his gaze to Maria, his tone dripping with feigned concern. "I'm just here to look out for you, Maria, to make sure you're using our family's resources properly." Maria met his gaze, her voice steady. "You're not here out of concern for me. You've only ever cared about yourself, about taking from others. My mother tried to protect me from this family's darkness, and I intend to honor her by making sure you can't take any more from us." David's expression soured, his mask slipping to reveal the bitterness beneath. "You think you're better than me? Living in this mansion, setting up your little charity? You're just like the rest of us. Sooner or later, you'll come to realize that." Maria's eyes flashed with determination. "No, David, I'm nothing like you. My mother wanted a different life for me, a life free from your influence. And I've chosen that life. This is your last chance to leave us alone." David scoffed, his bravado faltering. "Or what? You'll cut me off from the family fortune? You think you can just—" At that moment, Thomas stepped forward, holding a set of documents. "Mr. Harper, you're being formally served. Maria has filed a restraining order against you, effective immediately. Any attempts to contact her or to interfere with her affairs will result in legal consequences." David's eyes darkened as he took the papers, his hands shaking with anger. "You can't do this. You can't just cut me off." "It's done," Maria said firmly. "The trust, the foundation, everything my mother left me. You have no part in any of it. If you try to come near me or threaten my life in any way, you'll be held accountable." For a moment, David was speechless, his fury evident in his expression. But then, his face twisted into a bitter smile. "Fine," he sneered, tossing the papers onto the table. "Enjoy your fairy tale while it lasts. But remember, Maria, you'll always be one of us. You can't escape who you are." Without another word, he turned and stormed out, the echo of his footsteps fading as he disappeared down the hall. As the silence settled around them, Maria felt a wave of relief and exhaustion wash over her. She turned to Ethan, who reached out, pulling her into a comforting embrace. "It's over," he murmured, his voice filled with pride. "You did it, Maria. You took control." She nodded, feeling the weight of years of fear and uncertainty finally lift. "Thank you, Ethan," she whispered, "for everything." They returned to the mansion, where Maria spent the rest of the day in quiet reflection. She thought of her mother, of the sacrifices Elena had made, and felt a surge of gratitude that she had finally been able to honor her memory. For the first time, she felt truly free, free to live the life her mother had dreamed of for her. In the weeks that followed, Maria poured herself into her work at the foundation. News of her story, the legacy of her mother's resilience, The foundation's mission to support others facing hardship spread, drawing support and admiration from people far and wide. The foundation thrived, becoming a beacon of hope and transformation for those seeking a way out of difficult pasts. Ethan remained by her side, offering guidance and encouragement as they worked together to build a legacy that honored Elena's memory. Their bond grew stronger with each passing day, a relationship built on trust, love, and shared purpose. One evening, as they sat together on the terrace overlooking the mansion gardens, Maria turned to Ethan, her eyes bright with gratitude. "You know, I used to feel like I didn't belong anywhere," she said softly. "But now, I feel like I've finally found my place. A family, a purpose. It's everything I could have hoped for." Ethan smiled, his heart full as he looked at her. "You've always had a place here, Maria. You're my daughter, and nothing will ever change that." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun set over the gardens, the sky awash in hues of pink and gold. The mansion, once a symbol of wealth and isolation, had become a place of warmth and belonging, a true home. As night fell, Maria felt a quiet sense of contentment settle over her. She had finally broken free from the shadows of her past, reclaimed her mother's legacy, and built a future filled with hope and love. For the first time, she could look to the future without fear, knowing that she had the strength and the family to face whatever lay ahead. Ethan took her hand, giving it a gentle squeeze. "Here's to the life your mother dreamed of for you, and the future we're building together." Maria smiled, her heart brimming with gratitude. In that moment, she knew that Elena's love and the strength she had inherited would be with her always, a legacy that would carry her forward, no matter where life took her. And as she gazed out over the gardens, she felt her mother's presence, a gentle whisper of peace and pride, reminding her that she was never truly alone.